A poor dishwashing girl used the last few coins she had to pay a stranger's taxi fare on a rainy night, never knowing that this single ride would stop a bloody war, and that the man she had just helped was the most powerful crime boss in Chicago. Before we begin the story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to support us, and we hope you enjoy the story. That night, rain poured down over the cold streets of Little Italy. Elena had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift, her calloused hands red and aching, with only a few coins left in her pocket to catch a ride home to the ailing mother waiting up for her. She had no idea that just a few steps away, a man in a soaked black suit stood helpless by the roadside. No money, no phone, no one at his side. Nor could she have imagined that the few small coins she was about to give away would forever change the fate of them both, and save something far greater than she could ever dream. For sometimes the smallest moments turn out to be the very hinge of destiny, and the story of that rainy night was only the beginning. That same night, on the other side of Little Italy, Damiano Rossi was running out of time. The man who ruled every shadow in Chicago sat in the back seat of his car, his jaw clenched tight as he watched the rain streak across the window in long bands of blurred light, because in less than 40 minutes he had to be present at a meeting that could stop an entire war from breaking out. The heads of the Bianchi family had agreed to sit down and talk only once, and they had set 3 conditions upon which both sides had sworn their honor. He had to enter the negotiation room alone, his men had to remain at a distance, and no one was allowed to cross that doorway with him, because even a single bodyguard standing behind his shoulder would be seen as an insult and an act of provocation. He had to arrive precisely on time, because the old Bianchi boss was a man who measured respect by the minute, and being even 1 minute late would be enough to make him believe Damiano had never truly wanted peace. And he wasn't allowed to bring anything with him except himself and his word. No threats, no leverage, no hidden card tucked inside his sleeve. For months, Damiano had kept the 2 rival families from tearing into each other through nothing but nerves of steel and the weight of his own reputation. And tonight was the night when everything would either hold or shatter. He believed he had accounted for every possible outcome. He hadn't accounted for Tommaso. Tommaso had driven for him for 6 years, had opened his car door, had poured his coffee, had been trusted with the most private places where Damiano kept his secrets, and it was Tommaso who slowed the car on that flooded side street that night and muttered that something was wrong with the engine. The instant the wheels stopped turning, Damiano knew. He felt it the way an animal feels a trap closing around it. A cold certainty spreading through his chest before reason could even give it a name. The engine hadn't died because it was broken. It had died because someone wanted it dead. Tommaso stepped out into the rain, and he didn't look back, and the simple fact that he avoided Damiano's eyes told him everything. By the time Damiano forced the car door open, the driver had vanished into the darkness between 2 rows of buildings, and the men who should have been following 2 cars behind were nowhere on the street, because they had been sent elsewhere by a false order Damiano knew nothing about. When he pulled his phone from inside his coat, it was dead. Its screen cracked into a spiderweb from an impact he had never felt, and he understood that even this had been arranged hours earlier, by hands he had once trusted. He stood beneath the pounding rain, in a suit worth more than most people earned in an entire year, and for the first time in a very long while, all of it was useless. He couldn't call his men because the phone was broken. He couldn't have another car brought to him for the same reason, and even if he had been able to call, no one could have crossed the streets drowning under floodwater and reached him in time. He couldn't appear at the meeting with a line of men behind him, because doing so would break the very oath he was going there to protect. Whoever had arranged this understood him completely, understood that his own rules would become the bars of the cage that trapped him, that the peace he had built with his own hands would be used to imprison him inside it. If he failed to appear at that table, alone, and exactly on time, the Bianchi family would believe he had spat on their goodwill, and before dawn, the 2 families would fall upon each other and tear one another apart, and his name would carry the blame. He looked down the empty street, watched the rain lash the pavement, felt every second slipping away, And he felt something he wasn't accustomed to feeling, something almost like fear, because Damiano Rossi, the most powerful man in the city, had suddenly become a man with nothing left in his hands, while the clock inside his head kept counting down toward a war he was about to lose, before he had even thrown a single blow. It was in that moment, with the seconds slipping through his fingers like water, that a taxi came around the corner and slowed to a stop just ahead of him, its yellow shape blurred behind the curtain of rain. Damiano moved toward it, the way a drowning man reaches for anything solid, and he pulled the door open and leaned in and told the driver where he needed to go. The driver turned in his seat and looked him over, taking in the soaked hair plastered to his forehead, the ruined suit clinging to his shoulders, the water running off him in streams onto the seat, and something in that look changed. Damiano saw it happen. He had spent his whole life being measured by men, and he knew the exact moment a man decided he was looking at trouble rather than a customer, and so he did the only thing left to him, which was to tell the truth. He said quietly that he had no wallet, that it had been taken from him that night along with everything else, that he had no money on him at all, but that he would pay 3 times the fare the moment he reached where he was going, and that he gave his word on it. The driver let out a short, tired laugh, the laugh of a man who had heard every story 100 times, and he said he heard that one 4 or 5 nights a week, from men in fine clothes and men in rags alike, and that the last 3 who promised to pay at the other end had opened the door at the light and run. He said he was sorry, that it was nothing personal, but no money meant no ride. And Damiano Rossi, who had never in his life been told no by anyone who mattered, stood there with the rain running down his collar and felt the trap close completely, because the one thing that might carry him to that table in time was about to pull away with him standing on the curb. That was when a voice spoke beside him, quiet and tired but perfectly steady. A young woman had stepped up out of the dark, a thin coat pulled tight around her, her dark hair soaked flat against her cheeks, and without any ceremony at all she leaned past him toward the open window and pressed a small handful of coins into the driver's palm, the last coins she had, the ones that were meant to carry her home. She did not look at Damiano the way people usually looked at him. There was no fear in her face, no calculation, no hunger for anything he might be worth. She only glanced at him with gray eyes that held nothing but exhaustion and a plain, ordinary kindness, and she said, "Get in, before he changes his mind." For a moment he could not move, because in all his years, in a world built entirely on debts and favors and the careful trading of one thing for another, no one had ever handed him something and asked for nothing back. He heard himself say that she should not do this, that she clearly needed it more than he did, and she only shook her head, water dripping from her chin, and told him she already had, and that he had better hurry. He got into the taxi with the strange sensation of a man stepping onto ground he did not understand, and as the door swung shut he turned to look at her through the streaked glass, wanting to say something that might match what she had just done, and he asked her why she would spend her last coins on a stranger. She had already begun to turn away into the rain, but she paused and looked back at him over her shoulder and gave him the smallest, weariest smile, and she said that everyone needs a little help sometimes. And then she was gone, swallowed by the dark and the downpour, a small figure in a thin coat, walking away from the only warm thing she could have kept for herself. Damiano sat frozen as the taxi pulled forward through the flooded streets toward the table, where a war waited to be born or buried, and he could not tear his mind away from her. And even as the clock kept ticking in his skull, some cold and careful part of him, the part that had kept him alive all these years, began without meaning to gathering up the few things he knew about her, the pale uniform beneath her open coat, with the faded name of a restaurant stitched at the collar, the number of the bus line whose shelter she had come from, the exact corner where she had stood, folding each small detail away in the back of his mind, because Damiano Rossi never forgot a debt, and he had just been handed the largest one of his life by a girl whose name he did not even know. The taxi pulled up outside the old restaurant at the edge of the harbor with less than a minute to spare, and Damiano stepped out into the rain, straightened his ruined jacket, and walked through the doors alone. exactly as he had sworn he would. The private room at the back was dim and heavy with silence, and at the far end of a long wooden table sat the Bianchi patriarch, an old man with a face carved from stone and eyes that had watched 100 men lie to him across 40 years, flanked on either side by his 2 sons and a handful of grim, watchful figures standing back against the walls. When Damiano entered, the old man made a slow, deliberate show of glancing up at the clock, and then he smiled a thin, cold smile and said that he had begun to believe the great Rossi would not come at all, that he had already started to think this whole evening had been a courtesy extended to a man who had chosen war before he ever sat down. Damiano took his seat without a word, poured himself a glass of water with a hand that did not shake though his heart was still hammering from the streets, and told the old man that he was here, alone and on time, exactly as they had agreed, and that a man who wanted war did not walk through a storm to sit at his enemy's table. The elder son leaned forward at once, his voice sharp with accusation, and said the Rossi had been moving men through Bianchi territory in the small hours of the night, that shipments had been touched, that his family had been insulted in a dozen small ways, designed to provoke, and that everyone in the room knew Damiano had been preparing to strike first under the cover of these talks. The younger son said something harder still, and the temperature in the room climbed, and every man standing along those walls shifted his weight, waiting for the one wrong sentence that would end it all. But Damiano was listening, truly listening, and something began to take shape in his mind as the accusations came. They were too precise. They were too well-timed. The Bianchi knew details of his own operations that no outsider could know, dates and routes and names that lived only inside his own house, and it struck him with sudden cold clarity that someone had been standing between the 2 families whispering into both sets of ears at once, feeding each of them the fear of the other, building this fire patiently over months, and then arranging tonight so that the empty chair at this table would light the match. He set down his glass and asked the old man a single quiet question. He asked whether the same man who had brought him these warnings about the Rossi had also been the one urging him toward war, and he watched the patriarch's stone face flicker, just once, and he knew he had found it. Then he laid it out plainly. He told the old man that his car had been disabled that very night, his phone destroyed, his driver bought and gone, his men sent away by an order he never gave, all of it timed with the precision of a watchmaker, so that he would fail to appear and this piece would collapse under its own weight, without anyone having to fire a single shot. He said that no one profited from such a thing except a man who stood to grow rich on 2 families tearing each other apart, and that if they went to war tonight, they would be doing it as the willing instruments of whoever that man was. The room went very still. The old patriarch studied him for a long moment, and his ancient eyes moved slowly over Damiano, over the soaked hair, the ruined suit still dripping quietly onto the floor, the exhaustion he had not entirely managed to hide, and that ruin spoke louder than any polished speech ever could have, because a man who had schemed to trap the Bianchi would not have arrived looking like a man who had himself just clawed his way out of a trap. At last the old man raised one weathered hand, and his sons fell silent at once, and he said that in 40 years he had learned to tell the difference between a liar and a hunted man, and that tonight he was looking at the second. He said that if there was a snake feeding poison into both their houses, then the war that snake wanted would be the snake's victory, and no one else's, and that he had not lived this long to hand any man such a gift. He rose and extended his hand across the table, and Damiano took it, and in that single grip, the war that had been minutes away from breaking loose died quietly before it was ever born. That night Damiano did not sleep. He returned to the quiet of his home high above the city, where the lights of Chicago spread out below the windows like a field of cold stars, and he sat in the dark with a glass he never touched, and he could not make his mind go still. He had spent the whole of his life learning to control every variable, to leave nothing to chance, to owe no man, and let no man owe him, without knowing the exact weight of the debt down to the last decimal. And yet tonight, the single most important thing that had happened to him had come from a stranger, whose name he did not know, whom he could not repay, and whom he had no idea how to find. He kept returning to that curb, to the gray eyes that had looked at him without fear, to the small, tired smile she had given him over her shoulder, to the way she had turned and walked off into the storm, as though she had done nothing worth remembering, as though pressing her last coins into a stranger's hand in the pouring rain was simply what a person did when someone needed help. He was not a man given to sentiment, and he did not let himself follow the thought all the way to its end, because some careful part of him shied away from the size of what waited there, the way a man will not look directly into the sun. But the feeling was there all the same, sitting heavy and unmoving in his chest through the long hours, a debt without a shape, a certainty that his entire life had turned on the hinge of one small kindness, and that he had walked away from it without so much as learning who she was. It gnawed at him quietly, and would not let him rest, because Damiano Rossi had never in his life carried a debt he could not measure, and this one felt vast and formless, and impossible to set down. By the time the first gray light crept over the skyline, he had stopped pretending he was going to let it go. He rose and showered and dressed in a fresh dark suit, and when his men began to arrive that morning he was already waiting for them, calm and clear-eyed. The exhaustion burned away into something like resolve. He called for Enzo, the one man in his circle he still trusted without reservation after everything that had happened, and he told him there was something he needed found. Enzo waited, expecting the name of the traitor, expecting orders about the fire that had almost consumed them all, and Damiano surprised him. He described a young woman instead, somewhere in her mid-20s, he said, dark hair, gray eyes, a thin worn coat, and beneath it a pale uniform with the name of a restaurant stitched at the collar, though he had caught only part of the letters through the rain. He gave the corner where she had stood, the number of the bus line whose shelter she had come out of, the hour it had happened, every small detail he had folded away without meaning to. Enzo listened, and a flicker of confusion crossed his face, because in all the years he had served the Rossi family, he had never once heard his boss ask him to find a woman. Least of all, one who by every sign had nothing at all. No money, no name, no power, nothing a man like Damiano could need. He asked, carefully, whether she had done something, whether she was a threat, whether she was tied to the men who had betrayed him. Damiano was quiet for a moment, looking out at the waking city, and then he said no, she was not a threat. She was the opposite of a threat. She was someone he owed, and he did not explain further because he could not, because he did not yet have the words himself for what she was to him. He only said that he wanted her found quietly, without questions asked of her, without anyone approaching her or frightening her, that no one was to speak to her at all, and that when she was found, he wanted to know where and nothing more. Enzo nodded and went to make his calls, and Damiano stood alone at the window with the whole vast city laid out beneath him, a man who could command almost anything in it, and yet the only thing he wanted that morning was to find one girl in a thin coat who had vanished into the rain, and to understand at last what she had done to him. While Damiano stood at his window searching for her, Elena was already awake in the small, cramped apartment she shared with her mother, moving quietly through the gray morning so as not to disturb the older woman's sleep. She had walked the long way home the night before, soaked through and without a coin to her name, and she had slipped into bed past midnight, only to rise again a few hours later, because rest was a luxury she had learned to live without a long time ago. She stood now at the stove warming a little broth, listening to the slow, uneven breathing from the other room, and that sound, more than anything else in the world, was the reason she kept going. Teresa Marchetti was 62 years old, and she had been a strong woman once, a woman with flour on her hands and a song under her breath, but the illness had taken that from her piece by piece over the last several years. Her kidneys were failing, and had been failing for a long time, and now 3 times every week Elena helped her mother down the stairs and across the city to sit for hours in a room full of quiet machines that did the work her body could no longer do. And each time they came home, Teresa was a little thinner and a little more tired than the time before. There was an answer. That was the cruelest part. A transplant would give her mother her life back, and her mother's name was already on the legitimate waiting list where it belonged. in its proper place among all the others. But a name on a list was not the same as a chance, because before any patient could be approved for the program itself, the hospital had to be satisfied that the care surrounding the operation could actually be paid for, the debts already owed, the surgery, the medications that would have to be taken every single day for the rest of her life to keep her body from rejecting the gift, the long months of follow-up care. And Elena could not pay for any of it. The unopened envelopes had been piling up on the little table by the door for so long that she had stopped looking at them, because she already knew what they said, and they all said the same thing, that the wall between her mother and the chance to live was made not of medicine, but of money, and that it was far taller than anything Elena could climb, by washing dishes until her hands cracked. She never told her mother how bad it was, Teresa asked sometimes, in that careful way mothers ask when they already suspect the answer, and Elena would smile and say it was all being handled, that she had it under control, and then she would go into the bathroom and run the water so the older woman would not hear her cry. There had been a time, not so very long ago, when Elena had allowed herself to hope that the wall might come down, and that hope had a name, and the name was Victor. He had come into her life like sunlight through a window, warm and certain and easy, a handsome man with beautiful words who told her she had carried too much alone for far too long, and that he wanted to carry it with her. He had sat at her mother's bedside, and held Teresa's frail hand, and called her by her first name. He had listened to Elena talk through her fears late into the night, had wiped her tears with his thumb, had promised her that he knew people, that he could arrange things, that together they would clear the debts and get her mother approved, and everything would finally be all right. And Elena, who had been strong for so long and was so tired of being strong, had let herself believe him. She gave him everything she had managed to save, every dollar scraped together over years of exhaustion, handed it to him gladly, because he said it was the first step toward her mother's life. And for one bright foolish season, she had felt that she was no longer facing the dark alone. Then one morning he was simply gone. The money was gone with him, and there was no address and no message and no trace of him anywhere, only the slow, sick understanding settling into her chest that the warmth had been a performance and the love had been a tool, and she had been nothing to him but an easy mark with a soft heart and a dying mother. It had left her poorer than before, because the debts she had taken on believing in him remained, and it had left her something harder than debt, a wound that had closed over into scar, and a promise she made to herself in the gray silence afterward, that she would never again hand her trust to a man with a warm smile and beautiful words, never again mistake being used for being loved. It took Enzo only 3 days to find her, and on the evening of the third, the little bell above the door of Rosa's restaurant rang, and Damiano Rossi walked in out of the fading light. The place was small and warm and honest, the air rich with simmering tomato and fresh bread, a handful of wooden tables filled with regulars who came for the food and for the kindness of the old woman who ran it, and it was nothing at all like the polished cold rooms Damiano usually moved through. He took a seat at a small table near the back where he could see the whole room, and he waited. When Elena came out from the kitchen carrying a tray, wiping her hands on her apron, she stopped so suddenly that the dishes rattled against one another. She knew him at once, though he looked nothing like the man she had left standing in the storm, dry now and composed in a dark suit that fit him as though it had been poured over his shoulders, and for a long moment she simply stared, because the last place she had ever expected to see that stranger again was here, in her world, at one of her tables. She approached slowly, warily, with the old instinct of a woman who had learned that when men sought her out, it was because they wanted something from her, and she asked him what he was doing there. He looked up at her with steady eyes and told her plainly that he had come to settle his debt, that she had paid his fare when he had nothing, and that he did not like to leave such things unbalanced. Elena let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, and shook her head and told him it had been a few coins, that it was nothing at all, that he owed her nothing and could keep whatever it was he had come to give. But he did not leave, and he did not argue. He simply asked whether she was going to let him order something, since he had come all this way, and whatever was cooking in that kitchen, smelled better than anything he had eaten in years, and there was such a mild stubbornness in the way he said it that she found no easy way to refuse. So she took his order, and she brought him a plate of the pasta the kitchen was known for, and she went back to her work. And yet all through that evening she was aware of him sitting quietly at the little table near the back, eating slowly, watching the room and watching her, not with the hungry appraising look she had long since learned to brace herself for from men, but with a strange still attention, as though he were trying to understand something he had not encountered before. When the crowd thinned and she found herself passing his table again, she stopped and crossed her arms and asked him outright what a man like him actually did for a living, because everything about him, the suit, the watch, the way the air in the room seemed to arrange itself around him, told her he was not the sort of person who ever found himself stranded on a corner without $1 to his name. He was quiet for a moment, and she saw something careful move behind his eyes. The brief calculation of a man deciding which cards to lay face up. Then he told her a version of the truth, that he worked in transport and in entertainment, that he owned clubs and had his hands in shipping and the moving of things across the city. It was not a lie, exactly, and she noticed at once that it was not quite a whole answer either, and it made her curious despite herself. She asked how a man in transport and entertainment had come to be standing in the rain with empty pockets, and for the first time she saw the ghost of a smile touch the corner of his mouth, and he said only that it had been a very bad night, and that a kind stranger had made it considerably better. Elena did not know what to make of him, this quiet man who repaid a handful of coins as though they had been a fortune and answered simple questions as though they were dangerous, and when he finally rose to leave he set down far more money than the meal was worth and told her to keep it. She opened her mouth to refuse, but he was already at the door, and he paused there with the bell ringing softly above him and told her that the food had been the best he had eaten in a very long time, and then he stepped out into the night, leaving Elena standing among the empty tables, unsettled and curious, and not at all certain what had just walked into her life. He came back the next evening, and the evening after that, and before long it became something Elena could almost set her watch by, the soft ring of the bell, as the last of the dinner crowd thinned, and Damiano crossing the room to that same small table near the back, the one that everyone at Rosa's had quietly begun to think of as his. He always ordered the same plate of pasta, and he ate it slowly, the way a man eats something he considers worth savoring, rather than something he is merely putting into his body. At first she told herself she did not care whether he came, that he was only a strange wealthy man with too much time and an odd conscience about a handful of coins. But she noticed all the same when the bell rang at his hour, and she noticed the small, hollow feeling on the rare night he was late. Little by little, the wariness between them began to thaw into something easier. She would stop by his table when the room had gone quiet, and he would ask her a question, and she would answer, and then she would ask one of her own, and their conversations grew longer and less careful until they no longer felt like two strangers circling one another, but like two people who were slowly beginning to know each other. She found, to her own surprise, that he was easy to talk to, that he listened in a way almost nobody did anymore, with his whole attention, without waiting for his turn to speak, and that he never once looked at her the way Victor had looked at her, with that warm hunger that only ever took. One quiet evening, when the rain had returned and there was almost no one left in the room, he asked her what she truly wanted, not what she needed to survive the week, but what she dreamed of when she allowed herself to dream. And Elena stood there, drying a glass that was already dry, because it had been a very long time since anyone had asked her such a thing. And then, softly, she told him. She told him about her mother's kitchen, about the Sunday mornings of her childhood, when Teresa would make pasta by hand at the table, folding and cutting and humming under her breath, filling their small apartment with warmth and the smell of good things, and how those mornings remained the happiest memory she owned. She told him that somewhere beneath all the exhaustion and the fear, she carried a dream of one day opening a place of her own, a small trattoria where she would cook her mother's recipes exactly as they had been taught to her, a warm, bright room where people would come and be fed and feel, even for an hour, that somebody had cared enough to make something for them by hand. And then her voice changed, and she said the rest of it, the part she had never said aloud to anyone. She said that the dream had a clock on it now. That she did not simply want to open that place someday. She wanted her mother to live long enough to walk through the door of it, to sit at one of the tables in her own kitchen brought back to life, to taste her own recipes made by her daughter's hands, and know that nothing she had given had been lost. She said that every month that passed was a month her mother grew weaker, and that some nights she lay awake doing the arithmetic of it in the dark, the money against the time, and the arithmetic never came out right. She stopped then and laughed a little, embarrassed, and told him it was foolish, that dreams like that belonged to people whose lives had not gone wrong. But Damiano did not laugh, and he did not tell her it was foolish. He watched her with that still quiet attention, and said that it did not sound foolish at all, that it sounded like the only kind of dream worth having, and she looked at him and saw that he meant it, and something in her chest loosened by the smallest degree. What she could not have known was what those evenings had come to mean to him, because Damiano had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something, who smiled at him out of fear or ambition or calculation, who saw the power he carried long before they saw the man carrying it. And here, at this small table in this warm, honest room, was a woman who did not know what he was, who argued with him and refused his money and asked him nothing but questions about himself, who treated him not as a boss or a threat or a prize, but simply as a man who had come in from the cold for a good plate of food. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Damiano Rossi was being treated like an ordinary person, and he found, to his own quiet astonishment, that this small room was the only place in the whole of his life where he could breathe. The rain had grown heavier by the time Elena finished her shift that night, and when she stepped out of the restaurant pulling her thin coat tight around her, she found Damiano waiting beside a quiet, dark car at the curb, and he told her simply that nobody should be walking home in weather like this, and that he would take her. She hesitated, because getting into that car meant letting him closer than she had let anyone in a long time, and because the last time she had allowed a man to carry any part of her burden it had cost her everything she had. But the night was cold, and the walk was long, and there was nothing in his manner that asked anything of her, so at last she nodded and got in. For a while they rode in a silence that was not uncomfortable, the wipers keeping their soft rhythm, the city sliding past in ribbons of wet light, and then she began quietly giving him directions, and with each turn the streets grew narrower and darker and poorer, the bright avenues falling away behind them, until they were moving through a part of the city that men in cars like his never had reason to see. She watched him from the corner of her eye, waiting for the small flicker of distaste she had learned to expect, and it did not come. When they reached the sagging old building where she lived, he stopped the car, and she thanked him and reached for the door, and in that moment, a light came on in a window on the second floor. The curtain drew back, and Damiano saw her. An old woman, thin to the point of frailty, her shoulders wrapped in a shawl, one hand on the glass, looking down into the street, through the rain, with the patient, searching expression of someone who had been standing there a long while. Elena followed his gaze and let out a small breath, half exasperation and half something much softer, and said that her mother did that every night, that she had told her 100 times to sleep and not to wait up, and that she never once listened. Damiano asked quietly who she was, and Elena said that was Teresa, that she was the only family she had left in the world, and that she was not well. She did not say more than that, but something in the careful flatness of it, the way a person holds a great weight very still so that none of it spills, told him far more than the words did, and he did not press her. Instead he asked, gently, whether she was carrying all of it by herself, and Elena gave a small tired laugh and said that she had learned it was safer that way, that people who offered to share a burden usually did it to get closer to whatever little you had left. She did not speak Victor's name, but the old wound was there in the guardedness of her voice, and Damiano understood that someone had taught her that lesson very cruelly. After a moment, he told her that he understood better than she might think, that he had grown up in a world where nothing was ever given without a price, and everyone who smiled at you wanted something from you, and that he had learned a long time ago to trust no one at all. She turned and looked at him then, surprised, because it was the first thing he had ever said that sounded less like the careful answer of a guarded man and more like the truth of one. And for a moment, the two of them sat together in the dark car, with the rain drumming on the roof, each recognizing in the other the shape of a wound they both carried, and neither would name aloud. Then the old woman shifted at the window above, leaning a little closer to the glass, and Elena roused herself and thanked him again, and slipped out into the downpour and up the crumbling steps to her door. Damiano did not drive away at once. He sat with the engine idling and watched that lighted window, watched the frail silhouette waiting there, watched Elena's shape appear beside her mother and gently guide her back from the cold glass, and something in his chest that had been still and cold for a very long time turned slowly over. He thought of the debt he owed this woman, the one that still had no shape. He thought of the old woman standing at that window night after night, waiting for a daughter who was working herself into the ground to keep her alive. And though he said nothing and made no promise to anyone, a quiet decision had already begun to take root, somewhere far beneath his thoughts, waiting in the dark. In the days that followed, Elena began to notice things she had not allowed herself to notice before. Small details that gathered quietly at the edges of her attention, the way storm clouds build far out over the lake, before anyone thinks to look up. That car she had ridden in was not merely expensive, she realized. It was heavy in a way ordinary cars were not. The doors thick and slow to swing, the windows strangely dense, and it was never the same man behind the wheel twice. Always a different silent figure who kept his eyes down and spoke only when spoken to. She noticed the way people treated Damiano when they did not know she was watching. A delivery man came into the restaurant one evening and stopped dead when he recognized the figure at the back table, and then busied himself and did not look up again. The owner of the shop across the street tipped his head in a small, careful nod when Damiano passed on the sidewalk, and it was not the nod of a neighbor greeting a neighbor. It was something closer to the gesture a man makes when he wants very much to be seen as respectful. She noticed his phone, and the calls he stepped outside to take, and though she never heard the words, she saw what happened to him during them, saw the warm, easy quiet drain out of his face, and something else settle in its place, his voice dropping into a register she had never heard him use with her, flat and absolute and cold as river ice, the voice of a man who had never in his life needed to raise it, because the world simply obeyed. And she noticed the money, always the money. The sums he left carelessly on the table at the end of an evening, enough to cover her rent for a month, laid down without a glance, as though the amount meant nothing at all, as though wealth flowed around him endlessly from some source she could not see and never would. At first she told herself that none of it mattered, that a man was allowed to be rich and private, and it was no business of hers. But the noticing would not stop, and slowly, against her will, a cold, old feeling began to rise in her chest, and she knew that feeling well, because she had lived inside it once before. She had felt exactly this in the bright fall season, when she had let herself believe warm words and a warmer smile, and she remembered with terrible clarity what it had cost her to look away from the small wrong details when they first appeared. She had ignored them then. The vague answers, the promises that were always just about to become real, the way the story never quite closed. She had told herself she was being suspicious and unkind, and she had made herself stop asking, and by the time the truth arrived, it had taken everything, her savings, her hope, her mother's chance. She was not that girl anymore, and so when she caught herself listening for the bell at his hour, when she felt the warmth of his quiet attention beginning to work its way through the wall she had built so carefully, she pulled back, frightened by how easily it was happening. There was something Damiano was not telling her. She knew it the way a person knows the weather is about to turn, and the not knowing sat in her stomach like a stone she could not swallow. A man that wealthy, that guarded, whose voice could make grown men lower their eyes, who answered every simple question with a careful half of an answer, was not a man living a simple life, and she had promised herself in the ashes of her last mistake that she would never again let herself be drawn into a story a man refused to tell her honestly. She did not want to believe he was deceiving her. Some part of her, the part that had begun to feel safe in his presence for the first time in years, begged her to let it go, to trust the plain kindness she was certain she had seen in him. But the scarred part of her, the part that had learned its lesson in loss and humiliation, whispered that she had felt safe before, that she had trusted a warm smile before, and that trusting it had very nearly destroyed her and her mother both. And so Elena went on smiling, and pouring his coffee, and taking his order at the little table near the back, and all the while, she watched him more closely than she had ever watched anyone, listening hard to the shape of everything he did not say. It happened on an ordinary evening, when Elena had left the restaurant early, to collect her mother's medication from a pharmacy that stayed open late, and had taken a shortcut home through the edge of the harbor district, where she rarely walked. The streets there emptied after dark, lined with old warehouses and shuttered offices, and she was hurrying along with her collar turned up against the wind, when something across the road made her slow, and then stop entirely. Two dark vehicles had pulled up outside one of the buildings, and from them stepped a handful of men in dark coats who moved with a silent, unhurried purpose, spreading out along the pavement without a word passing between them, their eyes sweeping the shadows in a way that told her they had done this many times before. And then a door opened, and Damiano stepped out, and Elena felt the breath stop in her throat. This was not the man who sat at the little table near the back of Rosa's and ate his pasta slowly, and asked her what she dreamed about. This was someone else entirely, someone she had never seen and could not have imagined, standing at the center of that ring of hard-faced men, and they arranged themselves around him the way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet, every one of them oriented toward him, waiting on nothing but his smallest gesture. A man had been brought out to meet him, an older man in a rumpled coat, and even from across the street Elena could see that he was terrified. It was in the way he held his hands, in the way his shoulders had drawn up toward his ears, in the small pleading motions he made as he spoke, the desperate gestures of a person trying very hard to be believed. Damiano listened to him without expression, his face a mask of stone in the pale light, utterly still while the other man came apart in front of him. And then Damiano said something, only a few words. Elena was too far away to hear them, but she did not need to hear them, because she saw what they did. The frightened man went absolutely rigid, and then he began to nod. He nodded and kept nodding, quickly, over and over, the way a person nods when they are agreeing to anything at all if only they will be allowed to leave. There was no warmth in Damiano now, none of the quiet gentleness she had come to know, only a terrible unhurried calm, the stillness of a man who did not need to raise his voice because the entire world already bent toward it before he spoke. And the men around him watched him with a deference that was not respect at all, but something much closer to fear. Elena pressed herself back against the cold brick behind her, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips, unable to look away, and unable to make what she was seeing fit into anything she understood. She had spent days telling herself that her suspicions were the scars talking, that she was punishing a decent man for another man's crimes, that she should let herself trust what her heart had already begun to believe. And now here it was in front of her, plain and undeniable, the thing she had felt without being able to name. She still did not know what he was. She had no word for it, no title, no explanation. She could not have said whether he was a criminal, or something worse, or something she had no category for at all. But she knew now, with a certainty that made her stomach turn over, that Damiano was dangerous, that men were afraid of him, that the quiet, gentle man who listened to her talk about her mother's kitchen was carrying something dark and enormous just beneath the surface of every conversation they had ever had. She watched until the frightened man was released, and hurried away down the street without looking back, and until Damiano turned toward the car, and then she slipped away into the shadows before any of those watchful eyes could find her, walking faster and faster, until she was almost running, the cold understanding soaking through her far worse than any rain ever had. The truth came for her 2 days later, in the middle of an ordinary lunch shift, from the small television mounted in the corner above the counter that nobody ever really watched. Elena had barely slept since that night by the harbor. She had told no one what she had seen, not Rosa, Certainly not her mother, and she had moved through her hours in a kind of fog, waiting for something without knowing what she was waiting for. She was carrying a plate of pasta out to a table, the same dish he always ordered, when the midday broadcast cut through the low murmur of the room, and a reporter's voice sharpened into words that stopped her where she stood. On the screen was a photograph of a face she knew, a face she had sat across from night after night, and beneath it, in bold letters, was a name, Damiano Rossi. The report spoke of a long-running federal investigation into the Rossi family, of an organization that had held the shadows of Chicago in its fist for 2 generations, of the harbor and the clubs, and the things that moved through the city after dark, and it spoke of the man at the head of it, the most powerful figure in the criminal underworld of the city, a man the authorities had circled for years and had never once managed to touch. It showed footage of him leaving a courthouse surrounded by lawyers, composed and untouchable, and then it moved on to something else entirely, as though it had not just torn the floor out from under a woman standing in a small restaurant on the other side of town. The plate slipped from Elena's hands. It struck the tiles and shattered, and the sound of it seemed to come from very far away, and she did not move. She stood among the broken pieces, staring up at the empty screen, while every fragment of the last several weeks reassembled itself around one single word she had never let herself imagine. Boss. Not a businessman with a private life. Not a wealthy man with reasons to be careful. The head of an empire built on fear, whose name made an entire city look at the ground, and she had let him into the small guarded space of her life. She had told him about her mother's Sunday kitchen. She had told him about the arithmetic she did in the dark. She had let him see the window where Teresa stood waiting every night. If your heart is breaking for Elena in this moment, type the words fresh pasta in the comments, and let us continue. She felt the blood leave her face, and she gripped the edge of a table to keep her legs beneath her, because the old wound in her chest was tearing open with a violence that stole her breath, and what poured out of it was worse than anything Victor had ever done to her. That was the thing she understood standing there in the wreckage. Victor had been a small, ordinary liar, a charming thief who took her savings and vanished, and it had nearly destroyed her, but he had been exactly what he appeared to be underneath. A weak man doing a weak, cruel thing. This was something else. This was a man of enormous and terrible weight, who had come into her life wearing the mask of a quiet stranger, who had sat in that warm, honest room and let her believe he was ordinary, who had listened to her open the most private door she had while withholding the single largest truth about who and what he was. And she could not tell anymore which parts had been real. That was the cruelest thing of all. She did not know whether the man who had waited outside in the rain to drive her home was real, or whether the stillness in his face when he looked at her mother's window had been real, or whether the whole of it had been a performance, the way Victor's tenderness had been a performance, and she had no way to ever know. Rosa hurried over and crouched down and began gathering the broken pieces, asking her over and over whether she was hurt, whether she had cut herself, but Elena could not answer. She could only stand there in the ruin of the plate, and the ruin of something much larger, understanding at last exactly who Damiano Rossi was, and understanding, too, that she had done the one thing she had sworn on everything she had left, that she would never do again. She had let a man's kindness fool her twice. That night Elena did not go home. Something had hardened inside her in the hours since the broadcast, the shock burning away into a cold, old, clean fury, and she found the address of one of his clubs, and she went there, because she could not carry the weight of it in silence for a single hour more. After all, she needed to stand in front of him and hear him say it out loud. The club was a world she did not belong to, all dark glass and low golden light, and the deep pulse of music beneath the floor, beautiful and expensive and faintly menacing, and the men at the door looked at her thin coat and her tired face, and moved at once to turn her away. She said his name. She said it loudly and clearly, Damiano Rossi, and something in her voice made them stop, and one of them spoke quietly into a device at his wrist, and a moment later she was being led through the crowd and up a flight of stairs into a quiet room above it all. He was there, and when he saw her, his whole face changed. the composed mask falling away into something almost like relief, because he had spent days searching for the words to tell her himself, and here she was, and he rose and said her name. She did not let him finish it. Everything she had carried across the city came out of her then. She told him that she knew, that she had seen the news, that she knew exactly who he was and what he was, and that the entire city knew it too, and she watched him go very still, and that stillness was its own confession. He tried to speak. He said that he had wanted to tell her, that he had been afraid of precisely this moment, and she cut through him like a blade. She asked him whether he had laughed at her, sitting there night after night in his beautiful suit, listening to a woman with cracked hands talk about her mother's kitchen, watching her hand him the only tender thing she had left. She asked whether it had amused him, the great and powerful boss of the city, to come down among the ordinary people and play at being one of them, to let a poor woman believe she had found somebody honest. Her voice was shaking, not with weakness, but with the force of everything rising through her, and she said that she had let him drive her home, that she had let him see her mother standing at that window, that she had told him things she had never told another living soul, and the whole time he had been sitting behind that quiet face, knowing what he was. He said no. He said that he had never once laughed, that nothing about it had been a performance, that those evenings were the only real hours in his entire life. But she was not hearing him anymore, because the old wound had torn wide open, and it was another voice she was hearing underneath his, another pair of warm eyes she was seeing behind his own. She told him that she had met a man like him once before, a man with beautiful words and a warm smile, who sat at her mother's bedside, and held the old woman's hand, and promised he would help her save her. A man who took everything she had and disappeared, and left her with debts and shame, and a mother still waiting to die. And she had sworn on the ashes of that, she said. She had sworn to herself that she would never again be stupid enough to mistake being used for being loved. And here she was, standing in a criminals' club, having done the same foolish thing all over again. She said that she understood now what she must have looked like to him, a curiosity, a diversion, something small and struggling that a bored, powerful man could pick up and turn over in his hands for a few weeks, because his own dark, glittering world had stopped entertaining him, another man laughing in her face. He crossed the room toward her, telling her she was wrong, that she did not understand, that she was more to him than she could imagine, and he reached for her hands. She pulled away as though his touch had burned her, and stepped back, and looked at him with eyes bright and hard and dry. She told him not to touch her. She told him not to follow her, not to come to the restaurant again, not to send anyone, not to write. She said that she had spent her whole life being taken from by men who decided that a poor woman's trust was theirs to spend, and that she would not stand here and be looked down on by one more of them. She said she did not care how powerful he was. She did not want his money, or his protection, or his apologies, or whatever it was men like him offered when they were finally caught. She said that all she had ever wanted was for someone to think she was worth telling the truth to, and that he, like every man before him, had decided she was not. And then, before he could say another word, before the stricken look on his face could work its way past her fury and reach the part of her that still, traitorously, ached for him, she turned and walked out, down the stairs, through the beautiful cold crowd, out into the night. And she left Damiano Rossi standing alone in that empty room above the music, the truth spoken at last and everything ruined by the speaking of it. In the days that followed, the two of them retreated into their separate worlds, and each world had grown colder and emptier than it was before. Elena buried herself in work, taking every extra shift she could get, scrubbing until her hands ached and washing dishes long past midnight, because when her body was exhausted, her mind had less room to wander, and when her mind was quiet, it wandered always to him. She told herself she was glad it was over. She told herself she had escaped before it could cost her anything, that she had protected herself the way she should have protected herself the first time, that this was what learning a lesson looked like. And yet the small table near the back of the restaurant sat empty every evening now, And every time the bell above the door rang, she felt her heart lift for half a foolish second before she remembered. And every time the disappointment settled a little heavier than the time before. She missed him. She hated that she missed him. The two feelings fought inside her without rest. Across the city, Damiano returned to the empire he had been born to rule, and found no comfort anywhere in it. He moved through his days as he always had, gave his orders, held his territory, sat at the head of tables where powerful men waited on his word, and all of it tasted like ash. He had spent his whole life untouched by loss, because he had never allowed himself to have anything he could not afford to lose, and now he understood, far too late, exactly what he had let himself want. The quiet room, the plate of pasta at the little table, the gray eyes that had once looked at him without fear. Those hours had been the only real thing he owned, and now they were gone, and what remained was precisely what it had always been, cold and glittering and hollow. He picked up his phone a dozen times and put it down a dozen times, because what could a man like him possibly say? How could he ask her to forgive the one thing he could never undo, the truth of what he was? And at home, in the small apartment, Teresa was watching her daughter. She had said nothing for days, but she had seen the shadows under Elena's eyes, and the way the light had gone out of her. And one evening as Elena sat on the edge of her bed helping her with her medicine, the old woman took her daughter's hand, and held it, and asked her, quietly, what had happened to the man who used to bring her home. Elena tried to wave it away, tried to say that it did not matter, that it had been nothing. But Teresa had lived too long to be fooled by her own child, and she said that a mother does not need to be told when her daughter's heart has been broken. So Elena told her, not everything, but enough. That he had hidden what he was, that he had let her believe he was somebody he was not. That she had been foolish enough to trust a second time. Teresa listened without interrupting, her thin fingers moving slowly over the back of Elena's hand, and when her daughter had finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that yes, he had hidden it, and that hiding it had hurt her, and that she had every right to her anger. But she also said this. She said that in her 62 years, she had learned that sometimes a person hides a part of himself, not because he means to deceive anybody, but because he is afraid that if he shows it, he will be judged and cast out before anyone has ever taken the trouble to see who he truly is underneath it. She said that a man with everything to gain does not sit night after night in a poor woman's restaurant looking, as her daughter had once described him, like someone who had finally come in from the cold, and then she was tired, and she slept. But her words stayed, and that night, Elena lay awake in the dark, long after the apartment had gone quiet, staring at the ceiling, torn between the scar that told her never to trust again, and the small, stubborn voice that whispered she had seen something real in him too. The call came on a gray afternoon while Elena was folding laundry in the small apartment, and it was from the hospital, and she answered it braced for the worst, the way she always was, because calls from the hospital had never once brought her anything but a new weight to carry. But the voice on the other end was warm and bright. The woman told her that the outstanding balance on her mother's account had been settled in full, that the cost of the operation itself had been guaranteed, along with the anti-rejection medications her mother would need every day for the rest of her life, and the months of follow-up care that came after. And that because of this, the financial review that had been holding everything back was now cleared, and Teresa Marchetti had been formally approved into the transplant program at last, and her name had come up in its proper turn on the donor list, where it had been sitting all this time, and a date had been set. Elena stood frozen with the phone against her ear, and the laundry forgotten in her hands, asking the woman to say it again, certain there had been a mistake that would be corrected the moment she let herself believe it. There was no mistake. Nobody had jumped a queue, and nothing had been arranged in any room where such things could be arranged, because that was never what the wall had been made of. The wall had been money, only money, the ordinary crushing wall of money that stands between so many people and the thing that would save them, and somebody had simply reached out and taken it down. She sank onto the edge of the bed, shaking, and she knew exactly who. There was only one person in the whole world who had seen her mother's frail figure standing at that lighted window in the rain, who knew what Elena was carrying and what it was costing her, who had the kind of resources that could make a mountain disappear overnight. And the thing that struck her hardest, the thing that made no sense at all, was the timing. He had done this after she had stood in his club and told him she never wanted to see him again, after she had told him not to come, not to send anyone, not to write. He had not done it to win her back, because he had no reason on earth to believe it ever would. He had done it knowing she would probably never speak to him again. She did not feel the simple flood of gratitude he might have expected. What rose in her was something far more turbulent, and it drove her out of the apartment and across the city to find him, because she needed to look at him and understand why. She reached him at one of his properties, and when they brought her to him, he stood at the sight of her and said nothing at all. She asked him whether it had been him. He did not lie to her, not this time. He held her eyes and said yes. She asked him why, and her voice came out tight and hard, and she told him she had not come to thank him, that she did not want to be bought, that she would not be one more person who owed Damiano Rossi something, one more frightened soul in his ledger. But he did not flinch, and he did not smile. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter and more naked than she had ever heard it. He told her he had not done it so that she would owe him anything. He told her he expected nothing, that he wanted nothing, that he had not even intended for her to ever learn his name was behind it, and that he had known perfectly well she was never coming back when he made the arrangements. And then he told her about the window. He said that since the night he sat in his car in the rain and watched a frail old woman standing behind a pane of glass waiting for her daughter to come home safe, he had not been able to sleep properly. He said the image would not leave him, a woman dying slowly for the want of money, while men like him let more than that slip through their fingers on a single evening without ever noticing. He said he had spent his entire life using what he had to take, and to control and to make people afraid, and that this was the first time he could remember using it to do something that was simply good. He said he had needed to do it, not for her, because he could not go on knowing that her mother would die, and that he had stood by with the power to prevent it, and done nothing at all. They stood in silence for a long moment after that, and then something in Damiano seemed to give way, some final wall he had kept standing even with her, and he said there was something she needed to hear, something he should have told her weeks ago. He asked her, quietly, whether she truly believed what she had said to him that night in the club, that she had been an amusement, a diversion, something small a bored man had picked up to entertain himself. And before she could answer, he shook his head slowly and told her that she had it exactly backward, that she had never once understood what she actually was to him, and that it was time she did. He asked whether she remembered the night in the rain, when she pressed her last coins into a driver's hand for a stranger who had nothing. She said of course she remembered. It was a few coins. It was nothing. And Damiano looked at her with an intensity that stopped the breath in her throat, and told her that it had been nothing, that it had been the single most important thing anyone had ever done for him in the whole of his life. Then he told her what that night had really been. He told her he had not simply been a man caught in the rain without his wallet, that he had been betrayed that evening by someone he had trusted for 6 years, deliberately stranded, his car disabled, and his phone destroyed, and his own men sent away by an order he never gave, all of it arranged so that he would fail to reach a meeting that could not be missed. He told her that he had been on his way to sit down alone with the head of a rival family, that 2 houses had stood on the very edge of a war that would have torn through the city and cost more lives than she could imagine, and that his walking through that door on time and alone had been the one fragile thing holding it back. He told her that if he had not appeared at that table, the old man would have believed the peace was a lie, and by morning it would all have come apart, and every death that followed would have carried his name. He said that whoever built that trap had understood him perfectly, had used his own rules as the bars of the cage, and that he had stood on that curb watching the last minutes bleed away with every resource in his empire suddenly worth nothing at all. And then, he said, his voice dropping low, a girl in a thin coat had stepped out of the rain, and given away the last money she had to a stranger who could offer her nothing in return, and that taxi had carried him to that table with less than a minute to spare, and the war never happened. The peace held. All of it, every part of it, because of her. He told her that she had spent all this time believing she was a poor woman who had done a small kindness for a rich man who could not possibly have needed it, when the truth was that she, with nothing, with the very last coins in her pocket, had saved a man who had everything. That she had reached into the machinery of his ruin without ever knowing it was there, and quietly undone the whole of it. He said that she had never been beneath him, not for 1 second, not from the first moment, that he had come looking for her not to entertain himself, but because he could not live with never learning the name of the person who had saved his life, and asked for nothing at all in return. And he said that he was standing here in front of her tonight, alive and free, for one reason only, and that reason was her. Elena stood absolutely still, the ground of everything she had believed shifting beneath her feet, because in the space of a few sentences, the entire picture had inverted itself. She had come here braced to be looked down upon one more time. She had arrived certain, in the deepest scarred part of herself, that a powerful man could only ever see a woman like her as something small, something to be spent and set aside, because that was the lesson the world had beaten into her, and Victor had signed his name to it. And instead he was telling her that in the one moment that had mattered most in his entire life, she had been the powerful one, that her few coins had been worth more than his wealth, and his men, and all the fear his name commanded, that he was breathing because of her. And something in that scarred and guarded place inside her, the place that had spent years certain she was the kind of person the world only ever used and discarded, felt the first crack of light break through, because for the first time a man was looking at her not as somebody to be pitied or spent, but as the reason he was still standing at all. In the days after that conversation, something settled into Damiano that he had never felt before, a certainty that had been circling him for weeks and finally landed, and it drove him at last to the decision he had not dared to name. He would get out. He had spent his entire life inside the walls of an empire he had never chosen, born into it, raised for it, told from the time he was a boy that this was his destiny, and that no door existed on the other side, and for years he had believed it, because he had never once been shown anything else. But Elena had shown him. She had let him sit at a small table in a warm, honest room, and be treated as a man rather than a name, and once a person has tasted that, the cold glitter of the old world can never be enough again. So he began, and he began carefully, because a thing like this could not be done in an afternoon. He was not walking out and slamming a door behind him. He was unwinding 30 years of machinery thread by thread, handing over territories piece by piece to men who could hold them without setting the city on fire, converting the shipping arm into something clean and lawful, closing the parts that could not be made clean at all, moving slowly enough that nothing collapsed and nobody panicked, because a sudden vacuum at the top of a house like his would invite exactly the kind of chaos he had spent years preventing. It would take months. He knew that. And every one of those months would be a month spent standing in the open, with one hand already off the wheel. The hardest part was his uncle. Salvatore was his father's brother, the last of the old guard, the keeper of the old ways, a hard, careful man who had helped raise Damiano to carry the name he was now trying to set down. When Damiano told him what he intended, the old man's face went cold, and then it went to fury. And he said that no man simply walked away from what generations had built, that everything they had was paid for in a currency that could not be refunded, and that his nephew was proposing to hand it all to whoever wanted it. And when Damiano did not waver, Salvatore's eyes narrowed, and he said the thing he had clearly guessed already, that this was about the woman, the dishwasher from the wrong part of the city, that his nephew was prepared to dismantle his own house for someone who scrubbed floors for a living. But then the old man's anger changed into something quieter and far more serious, and he leaned across the table and told his nephew to listen to him carefully, because this next part was not sentiment but arithmetic. He said that a man at the top of a house like theirs is not protected by his strength. He is protected by the fact that everyone believes he cannot be touched. And the moment a man begins to let go of the wheel, the moment the word spreads that he is stepping down, he stops being untouchable and becomes something else entirely. He becomes a man with his hands full and his back exposed. Salvatore said that he had watched it happen before, to better men than either of them, that the enemies never come while you are strong. They wait, patiently, sometimes for years, and they come precisely at the moment you begin to put down your shield. He said that every single person Damiano had ever crossed was watching him right now, and that they would not wait long. He said that there would be a price for this, and that it would not be paid by him. It would be paid by whatever he loved. Damiano did not raise his voice. He stood before his uncle, calm and immovable, and he told him that he understood the risk completely, and that he was taking it anyway. He said that for his entire life every decision that had ever mattered had been made for him before he was old enough to speak, that the empire and the role and the people he was permitted to know had all been a script written by other men and handed to him at birth. He said he had played that part for more than 30 years and had never once been asked what he wanted, and then he said, quietly, that for the first time in his life he was choosing for himself, and that nobody, not his uncle, not the family, not the whole weight of everything that had come before him, was going to take that choice away. Salvatore stared at him for a long moment and saw in his nephew's face something he had never seen there, not the cold obedience of a boy raised to rule, but the settled certainty of a man who had found something worth more than power. And though he turned away without giving his blessing, the warning he had spoken hung in the room long after both of them had gone. All through those months of unwinding his house, Damiano had never stopped pulling at one particular thread, and that thread was Tommaso. The peace with the Bianchi had held, quietly and steadily, the old patriarch keeping his word, as men of his generation did, and the two families had gone back to their separate business, without a shot fired between them. But Damiano had not forgotten that somebody had built that trap in the rain, and he wanted a name. It took time, because Tommaso had run far and hidden well, but men who betray for money always leave a trail of money behind them, and eventually the trail led somewhere. The traitor had not been the architect of anything. He had been bought, and the man who bought him was not a rival boss or an old enemy or anyone Damiano had ever sat across a table from. He was a broker, a fixer who moved like smoke through the lower currents of the city, who had no house and no colors and no loyalty to anything but his own pocket, who made his living by whispering into the ears of powerful men and quietly stoking their fear of one another, because when two houses went to war, there was always money to be made in the wreckage, and always territory left lying in the street for whoever had the nerve to pick it up. He had understood that if the Rossi and the Bianchi destroyed each other, the space they left behind would be his to feed on for years, and so he had bought a driver, and arranged an empty street in a storm, and very nearly set the whole city alight. His name was Victor Kane. Damiano turned that name over for a moment, without recognition, and then his men brought him the rest of the file, the long, grubby history of it, the trail of ruined people the man had left behind him over the years, the ones he had charmed and used and emptied before moving on. And there, buried among them, was an entry that stopped Damiano cold. A woman he had lived with for a season, a woman with a dying mother and a small amount of savings, a woman named Elena Marchetti. He sat with that for a long time, unable to move, as the terrible symmetry of it assembled itself in front of him. The same man, the same hand, the one who had stranded him in the rain and nearly cost him his life had been, years earlier, the one who had crept into Elena's life wearing the mask of love and taken from her the money that was meant to save her mother. Two people wounded by the same shadow, their lives cut across by the same man, and neither of them had ever known it. If that twist of fate just sent a chill through you, type the word freedom in the comments, and let us continue. But Victor Kane was not a man who forgot a loss, and he had lost a great deal when that war failed to happen. He had spent months quietly furious about it, and he had been watching ever since, waiting for his opening, and now, at last, the whispers reached him that the boss of the Rossi family was stepping down. that he was handing over territories, closing operations, unwinding the machine piece by piece. And Cain, who understood these things exactly as Salvatore had understood them, knew what that meant. It meant the untouchable man was no longer untouchable. It meant his hands were full, and his shield was down. It was the precise moment the old uncle had warned about, the moment every enemy waits for with the patience of a spider, and Cain had been waiting longer than most. Then he learned the other thing, the thing that turned an opportunity into something delicious. He learned there was a woman. And when he learned which woman, he actually laughed out loud, because the world was a very small place, and here was a thread he had already held once before. He remembered her, not as a person, because he had never once seen her as a person, but as a soft target he had worked, and drained, and discarded, and never thought about again. And now she was the one warm, unguarded thing in the life of the most powerful man in Chicago. The single place where a blade could reach him. So Victor Cain began to watch her the way he had watched her once before, patient and smiling and cold. He learned her hours and her streets. He learned about the sick mother, and he learned, in time, that a date had been set at the hospital, and he understood at once that this would be the day she was most distracted and least protected, the day her whole heart would be somewhere else entirely. And he sat back and waited for it, drawing his plans in the dark, while neither Elena nor Damiano had the faintest idea that the ghost they shared was walking toward them both. The day arrived at last, the one that had been circled on the calendar for weeks, and it came wrapped in a terrible irony, because it was the day Victor Cain had been waiting for too. Elena had brought her mother in before dawn, had sat beside her in the pale, quiet room while they prepared her, had held the frail hand in both of her own and told her that everything was going to be all right, and when they came to take her, Teresa had looked up at her daughter with those tired, patient eyes, and Elena had promised her, twice, that she would be right there when she woke. Then the doors closed, and Elena was alone in the corridor, with nothing left to do but wait. And after an hour of sitting she got up and walked out to the quieter hallway near the far stairwell simply to breathe. That was where he found her. He came up beside her without a sound, and when she turned and saw his face after all these years, the shock of it went through her like cold water. Victor Cain smiled at her, the same way he had smiled at her across her mother's bedside once, and he leaned in close, and he spoke very quietly, almost pleasantly, so that no one passing at the end of the corridor would have heard a thing. He told her exactly which floor her mother was on. He told her the name of the surgeon. He told her how easy it would be, in a building this size, for something to go wrong for a woman in her condition, and then he told her that she was going to walk out of that hospital with him right now, calmly, without a word to anybody, and that if she did, he would let the old woman finish her operation in peace. Elena stood very still. Everything in her wanted to scream, to run, to grab the arm of the first person she saw, and she did none of it, because she understood with perfect clarity that the only thing standing between her mother and this man was her own obedience. So she nodded once. And she walked out of that building beside Victor Cain in complete silence, past the nurse's station, past a young man mopping the floor, past a family sitting with paper cups of coffee, and not one of them looked up, and not one of them knew that a woman was walking calmly toward the worst thing in her life, to keep a promise she had made to somebody who could not hear her. What happened after that happened in two places at once. In a bright, clean room on the 4th floor, a team of people who did not know any of this was occurring bent over Teresa Marchetti and began the long, kneeing, careful work of giving her back her life. And across the city, in a cold, forgotten building down by the harbor, her daughter sat in the dark while Victor Cain made his phone call and named his price, savoring every syllable of it, telling the great Damiano Rossi that he held something precious now, and that the boss would come alone and unarmed and pay dearly, or he would never see the woman again. But Cain had made one error, the same error he had made his whole life, the error of a man who assumes everyone is as small as he is. He had calculated for a boss protecting an asset. He had not calculated for what he was actually dealing with. Damiano did not shout, and he did not bargain. Something in him went very cold and very clear, and then he did the last thing he would ever do as the head of the Rossi family. He reached out to the network he had spent 30 years building, and was in the middle of dismantling, all the eyes and ears that saw everything moving in the shadows of that city, and he used it, fully and without hesitation, one final time, not to hold territory, not to keep power, to find her, and it took a fraction of the time Kane could have imagined. The confrontation at the warehouse was brief. Kane had hired a handful of men, but hired men work for money, and the man who came through that door had spent his entire life commanding fear, and when they saw who it was standing there and what was in his face, their resolve came apart in front of them. It was over in moments, decisive and almost quiet, and when it was finished, Victor Kane's schemes had collapsed around him completely. The shadow that had haunted 2 lives dragged at last into the light, and stripped of every weapon he had ever used, undone not by cruelty, but by the one thing he had never possessed, a man willing to give up everything for someone other than himself. Damiano crossed the room to where Elena stood, and took her face gently in his hands, and asked if she was hurt, and she shook her head, and simply held on to him, and then he told her the other thing, the message that had just reached him, and it broke over her like the first sun after the longest night, because at that very hour, in that bright room she had been torn away from, the surgery had finished. It had gone perfectly. Her mother was going to live, and Elena understood, standing there in that dim warehouse with the danger past and her whole world restored, that this man had saved them both on the same day, by 2 entirely different means. Her from the dark, with everything he had left of his old strength, and her mother from death, with a quiet kindness he had never once asked to be thanked for. Weeks passed before the 2 of them sat down together again, weeks in which Teresa grew steadily stronger in her hospital bed, and then, at last, came home, and in which Damiano finished the long, slow work he had begun. And when they finally met, it was at the small, warm restaurant where it had all started, at the same little table near the back that had sat empty for so long. It was different now. All of it. There was nothing left hidden between them, no careful half of an answer, no shape moving beneath the surface of the conversation, and for the first time they sat across from one another, as 2 people who saw each other completely. He told her that it was done, that the last of it had been signed away and handed over, that the territories were no longer his, that the parts of his house that could not be made clean had been closed, and the parts that could had been turned into ordinary lawful businesses that would go on without him. He said that the name Rossi still meant something in this city, and probably always would, but that he no longer stood behind it, and that whatever price his uncle had warned him he would pay for his freedom, he had paid it now in full, and he would pay it again gladly. He said that he had nothing left to hide from her. No second life waiting in the shadows, no name that would rise one day on a television screen and shatter whatever they built. Only himself, an ordinary man at last, sitting in an ordinary room, wanting an ordinary life. Elena listened, and she looked at him, and she understood something she had been slowly arriving at for a long time. The man the whole city had feared, and the man sitting across from her, now bore almost no resemblance to one another, and she had finally learned to tell the difference between what the world says about a person and what a person actually is. Because she had seen it. She had seen him quietly take down the wall that stood between her mother and her life, and do it at the exact moment when he had every reason to believe she was gone from his life forever. She had seen him come for her in the dark, and choose her over everything he had left. The reputation was one thing, built by the world and by the life he had been born into, and never asked for, and the man was another, and she had watched the man prove himself, not with beautiful words, but with the only currency that had ever meant anything, which was sacrifice. And then, he told her what he wanted. He reached across the table, and said that he did not want to build something for her. He wanted to build it with her. He said that he had money enough to open 100 cold and glittering things and no interest at all in a single one of them, that the only future he could imagine that meant anything was a small warm room with her name on it, the place she had described to him on a rainy evening when she thought he was nobody, where she would cook her mother's recipes by hand, He said he did not want to be her rescuer, or her benefactor, or a man she owed anything to, and that if she ever felt for one moment that this was charity, he would walk away from it entirely. He wanted to be her partner, to stand beside her and build the good thing together, if she would have him. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and she felt the old wound inside her stir, the one that had spent years whispering that trusting a man was the surest way to be destroyed, and she waited for its familiar warning to rise and stop her. It was quieter now. Not gone, perhaps it would never be entirely gone, but quieter, because it had been answered again and again by things that could not be argued with. Victor had smiled at her and taken everything. This man had lied to her once, and only to be loved as a man rather than feared as a name, and when the truth came out, he had never once tried to buy her forgiveness. He had simply, over and over, in the dark where nobody was meant to see, chosen her good over his own. And so Elena Marchetti, who had sworn on the ashes of her betrayal that she would never trust a man again, looked across the small table at the one who had given up an empire, and she made the bravest choice of her hard and lonely life. She reached out and took his hand, and she said yes. The months that followed passed like something Elena had never dared to dream. Teresa grew stronger week by week, the color returning to her face, the terrible tiredness that had hollowed her out for years slowly lifting away, until one morning Elena came into the kitchen and found her mother standing at the counter on her own 2 feet, with her sleeves pushed up, and had to turn around and press her hand over her mouth so the older woman would not see her cry. And then the dream that had lived only in the dark for so long finally stepped out into the daylight. The little trattoria opened on a warm corner of Little Italy, exactly as Elena had once described it to a man she believed was nobody. A bright room with wooden tables and the smell of good things drifting out onto the pavement, and above the door was the name she had chosen, La Cucina di Mamma, the kitchen of my mother. It was not a memorial, that was the whole miracle of it. The woman it was named for walked through that door on opening day on her own 2 feet, moving slowly and holding her daughter's arm, and stood in the middle of the room looking around at all of it, with her hand at her throat, unable to say a single word. And on a quiet morning not long after, the two of them stood together at the long counter in the back, with flour on the wood between them, and Teresa, her hands still thin and trembling a little, showed her daughter once more how to fold and cut the dough the way her own mother had taught her, half a century ago, and Elena, who was 27 years old and had done it 10,000 times, let her mother teach her anyway, and neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. The place filled up almost from the first week. Ordinary people came, and came back, and brought other people, and among them, every day, moving between the tables and carrying plates and learning slowly how to be perfectly ordinary, was Damiano. And then one evening, when the room was full, and the light was gold and the sound of it was the sound of happy people, he stepped out into the middle of the floor, and everything went quiet. He went down on one knee in front of Elena, and there was a small ring in his hand, and when he looked up at her, his voice was not steady at all. He told her that from the moment she gave away the last coins in her pocket to a stranger in the rain, she had saved a man the whole world had already given up on. He said that she had taught him the thing that a lifetime of wealth and fear had never once managed to teach him. That real power is not money, and it is not being feared. It is kindness, given freely to someone who can never pay you back. He said that he had walked through half his life believing he had everything, until a woman with nothing showed him he had nothing at all, and that he could not imagine another day of it without her, and he asked her to marry him. Elena was crying before he finished. She did not need a second to think. She said yes, and the whole room came apart in applause, strangers wiping their eyes at their tables, old Rosa standing in the kitchen doorway with both hands pressed to her face, and Teresa Marchetti alive and well, and watching her daughter from the seat by the window, seeing all of it, being there for it, which was the only thing Elena had ever really wanted. And in that warm, bright room, in the kitchen that carried her mother's name, Elena understood that every hard year she had survived had been carrying her toward this, because sometimes the smallest moments truly are the hinge of destiny, and one small act of kindness on a cold, rainy night can change the whole course of two lives forever. And that is what this story leaves with all of us tonight. That the real wealth in this world is not money and not power, but kindness and the simple things, and that very often, the people who have the least are the ones who give the most. And a single generous heart can save a life in a way that no fortune ever could. If the story of Elena and Damiano touched your heart tonight, please give this video a like, share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so you can join us for many more meaningful and moving stories every single day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, and which moment moved you the most, so please leave a comment and share what is deep in your heart with us, because we read every single one, and we treasure every word you send. And to everyone listening tonight, we wish you good health, a joyful life, and peace in every one of your days. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next story.